The sky over Japan burned. It was March 10, 1945, and the sun hadn't yet risen over Tokyo when Captain James "Jim" Harlan felt the Boeing B-29 Superfortress shudder beneath him. Not the normal vibration of four Wright R-3350 engines pulling 141,000 pounds through thin air at 25,000 feet. This was different. This was wrong. Thump. The sound echoed through the fuselage like a hammer striking an oil drum. Then another. And another. Flak. Flak at 11 o'clock. First Lieutenant Danny Morrison's voice cracked over the intercom from the nose turret, his words swallowed by the roar of engines and the distant thunder of anti-aircraft fire blooming across the night sky like deadly fireworks. Jim's hands tightened on the yoke. His B-29, tail number 44 to 69,803, call sign City of Angels, was part of the 73rd Bombardment Wing, returning from a low-altitude incendiary raid on Tokyo's industrial heart. Behind them, the city glowed orange and red, a firestorm that would be visible for 100 miles. They'd done their job. They'd dropped their payload of M-69 incendiary clusters right on target. Now all they had to do was make it home. All they had to do was survive the next 3 hours. The flak burst closer now. Black puffs of smoke materialized in the pre-dawn darkness, each one a deadly flower of shrapnel expanding at supersonic speed. Jim banked left, threading between explosions, his co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Frank Chen, calling out altitude and airspeed in a steady, mechanical voice that betrayed none of the fear they all felt. 24,000 feet, 280 knots, holding steady. Then the world exploded. A flak shell detonated 20 feet off the right wing. The shock wave hit like a physical blow. Metal shrieked. Glass shattered. The B-29 lurched violently to the right, throwing Jim against his harness so hard it knocked the wind from his lungs. Alarms screamed. Red lights flashed across the instrument panel like a Christmas tree from hell. "Number 3 engine is hit," Frank shouted, his steady voice finally cracking. "We're losing oil pressure." Jim fought the controls, muscles straining as he forced the massive bomber level. Through the cockpit window, he could see it, engine number 3, the inboard starboard engine, trailing thick black smoke. Flames licked from the cowling, small at first, then growing. "Feather number 3. Jim barked. "Kill the fuel." Frank's hands flew across switches and levers. The propeller on engine 3 gradually stopped spinning, blades turning edge-on to reduce drag. The fire guttered, starved of fuel, but didn't die completely. Orange embers still glowed in the engine nacelle. "Fire's not out," called Technical Sergeant Mike Hammer Kowalski from the flight engineer's station behind the cockpit. Extinguisher didn't get it all. If it spreads to the wing tanks. He didn't need to finish. They all knew. The B-29's wing tanks held over 8,000 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel. If the fire reached them, they'd become a fireball at 24,000 feet. But that wasn't the worst of it. "Captain." Frank's voice was quiet now, deadly quiet. He was staring at the fuel gauges, and his face had gone pale in the red glow of the instrument lights. "We're losing fuel. Fast." Jim looked down. The main tank gauge was spinning backwards like a broken clock. They'd left Tokyo with enough fuel for the 8-hour round trip to Guam, their base in the Marianas, plus a comfortable reserve. Now the needle was dropping. 10,000 pounds. 9,500. 9,000. "Shrapnel must have punctured the main tank," Hammer said, his voice tight. "Maybe the transfer lines, too. We're bleeding fuel into the slipstream." Jim's mind raced. They were 1,500 miles from Guam. At their current fuel consumption rate, they wouldn't make it halfway. And they couldn't ditch in the ocean, not with 9 men aboard and water so cold it would kill them in minutes even if they survived the impact. "Options," Jim said, forcing his voice to stay calm. "A captain's fear spreads faster than fire. Iwo Jima, Frank said immediately. "It's 750 miles southeast. The Marines just took it last month. They've got a runway." Iwo Jima, a volcanic rock in the middle of the Pacific, still smoking from one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. But it was halfway to Guam. And right now, it was their only chance. "Set course for Iwo," Jim ordered. "And somebody pray that runway's long enough for us." The B-29 banked southeast, leaving the burning city behind. Below them, the Pacific stretched out like black glass, endless and unforgiving. The fuel gauge kept dropping. And in the back of the aircraft, where the gunners manned their remote turrets, nobody spoke. They all understood what silence meant. They had to make landfall before the fuel ran out, or they would all die together in the dark water below. The cockpit of City of Angels smelled like hot metal, hydraulic fluid, and fear. Jim kept the B-29 at 12,000 feet now, lower than he wanted, but every foot of altitude cost fuel they didn't have. The air was thicker down here, warmer, but the 4 remaining Wright R-3350 engines could breathe easier. Or 3 remaining engines, really. Number 3 was dead, its propeller feathered, the metal still radiating heat from the fire that had finally burned itself out 20 minutes ago. 20 minutes. It felt like 20 years. Frank had his eyes glued to the fuel gauges, doing the math over and over in his head. Jim could hear him muttering numbers under his breath: fuel consumption rates, distance remaining, time to target. Every calculation ended the same way. They weren't going to make it. "Captain." Hammer's voice came through the intercom, steady and professional despite what they all knew. "Fuel state is critical. We're down to 4,200 pounds. At current consumption, we've got maybe 90 minutes of flight time. Less if we hit headwinds." Jim checked his watch. 0547 hours. The sun was breaking over the eastern horizon now, painting the Pacific in shades of copper and gold. Beautiful. Deadly. They'd been in the air for 6 hours and 15 minutes since leaving Guam. Iwo Jima was still 340 miles away. "Can we make it, Frank?" Jim asked quietly. Frank didn't answer right away. He was scribbling numbers on his kneeboard, checking and rechecking. Finally, he looked up, and his eyes told Jim everything. "Not at this altitude. Not at this speed. Then we go lower. And slower. Captain, if we go any lower." "We go lower," Jim repeated, his voice harder now. "Drop to 8,000 feet. Pull the power back to maximum endurance cruise. We stretch every drop of fuel as far as it'll go." Frank nodded and reached for the throttles. The engine note changed, dropping from a roar to a deep, throaty rumble. The B-29 began descending, the altimeter unwinding slowly. 11,000 feet. 10,000. 9,000. In the back of the aircraft, Staff Sergeant Willie Davis sat at his radio operator station, headphones pressed tight against his ears, listening to the endless crackle of static. He'd sent out their position and status 30 minutes ago. 1 engine out, fuel critical, attempting emergency landing at Iwo Jima. The response had been immediate. "Roger, City of Angels. Iwo Tower is standing by. Emergency cruise on alert. Good luck. Good luck." As if luck had anything to do with it. Willie glanced at the crew around him. Technical Sergeant Ray "Pappy" Henderson manned the central fire control system, watching the radar scopes for any sign of Japanese fighters. At 29, Pappy was the oldest man on the crew, and he had the calm, unshakable demeanor of someone who'd already accepted death and found it less frightening than a bad cup of coffee. Behind Pappy, in the cramped tail gunner position, sat Sergeant Tommy Bridges, just 19 years old, barely old enough to drink but old enough to die. Tommy hadn't said a word in 40 minutes. He just stared out the plexiglass canopy at the ocean below, watching it get closer as they descended. "How we doing up front?" Pappy's voice broke the silence. "We're doing," Jim replied, which wasn't really an answer but was all the answer any of them needed. At 8,000 feet, the B-29 leveled off. The airspeed indicator settled at 210 knots. Slower than Jim liked, slower than was safe if they encountered trouble, but it was the best fuel economy they could manage. Every gallon mattered now. Every mile counted. "Fuel at 3,800 pounds, Frank announced. "Distance to Iwo, 295 miles. The math was getting tighter. Jim looked out the cockpit window at the endless blue below. Somewhere down there, in that vast expanse of water, were hundreds of American servicemen who ditched their aircraft and were never seen again. The Pacific didn't forgive. It didn't give second chances. You either made it to land, or you became another statistic in some after-action report that nobody would ever read. "Captain." It was Danny Morrison, the bombardier, still in the nose section. "I've got something on the horizon. 12 o'clock. Jim leaned forward, squinting against the rising sun. At first, he saw nothing. Then there. A dark smudge on the horizon, low and flat. "Confirm that's Iwo Jima," Jim ordered. Frank was already checking the navigation charts. "Bearing matches. That's her. About 270 miles out. 270 miles. Maybe an hour and 15 minutes at their current speed. Maybe." The fuel gauge read 3,600 pounds. Jim did the math in his head one more time. They were burning roughly 2,800 pounds of fuel per hour at this power setting. They had 3,600 pounds remaining. That gave them about 77 minutes of flight time. 77 minutes to cover 270 miles. It was going to be close. Impossibly close. "All right, listen up," Jim said over the intercom, keeping his voice level. "We're going to make it to Iwo. But it's going to be tight. Real tight. I want everyone secured for emergency landing. Gunners, get out of the turrets and brace in the radio compartment. Pappy, you're in charge back there. Make sure everyone's strapped in. We may be landing with empty tanks, and I don't know what kind of condition that runway's in." "Roger that, Captain," Pappy replied. Jim paused, then added, "And boys, it's been an honor flying with you. All of you." Nobody responded. They didn't need to. The minutes crawled by. The fuel gauge kept dropping. 3,400 pounds. 3,200. 3,000. The dark smudge on the horizon grew larger. Iwo Jima was shaped like a pork chop, a volcanic island barely 5 miles long, dominated by Mount Suribachi on the southern tip. Jim could see it now through the windscreen, a cone of gray-black rock rising 550 feet above the sea. The American flag flew from its summit, planted there by Marines who'd fought and died on every inch of that cursed rock. 2,800 pounds of fuel. Iwo Tower, this is Army Air Force Bravo 29er, tail number 4469803, requesting emergency landing, Frank transmitted. "We are critically low on fuel. 9 souls on board. 1 engine out. Request priority clearance." The radio crackled. "Bravo 29er, Iwo Tower. You are cleared for immediate landing, runway 1. Wind is 080 at 12 knots. Crash crews are standing by. Runway is 7,000 feet, partially damaged. Repeat, runway is partially damaged. Be advised." Static swallowed the rest. "Say again, Iwo Tower," Frank said. "You broke up." More static. Then faintly, "Craters and debris. Exercise extreme caution on landing roll." Jim's jaw tightened. Partially damaged. Craters and debris. The runway had been extended and repaired after the battle, but Iwo had taken a beating. Artillery shells. Bombs. Blood. 2,400 pounds of fuel. They were 20 miles out now. Jim could see the island clearly, the black volcanic sand, the shattered vegetation, the scars of recent combat. And there, running down the center of the island, a single runway carved into the rock and ash. "Gear down," Jim ordered. Frank pulled the landing gear lever. There was a deep mechanical chunk as hydraulic systems engaged, and 3 heavy wheels dropped into the slipstream. The B-29 shuddered with the added drag. 2,100 pounds of fuel. Flaps to 20. The trailing edge of the wings extended, great metal panels unfolding to slow the aircraft. The B-29's nose pitched up slightly. Airspeed dropped to 175 knots. 15 miles. 1,900 pounds. Jim lined up on final approach. The runway stretched ahead, a narrow strip of coral and crushed rock, pockmarked and patched. He could see the crash trucks now, red and white vehicles racing into position along the runway edges, crews ready to pull them from the wreckage if it came to that. 10 miles. 1,600 pounds. The aircraft was descending at 500 feet per minute, a controlled fall toward the island. Jim's hands were steady on the yoke, but inside, his heart hammered against his ribs. Everything depended on the next few minutes. 5 miles. 1,200 pounds. "Full flaps," Jim said. "Full flaps," Frank echoed. The B-29 slowed further. 160 knots. 155. The stall warning light flickered. 3 miles. 900 pounds. They crossed the coastline at 800 feet, Mount Suribachi off to their left, the American flag snapping in the wind. Below them, shattered pillboxes and burned-out vehicles littered the black sand. Graves marked with white crosses stretched in neat rows. So many crosses. 2 miles. 600 pounds. The runway rushed up to meet them. Jim pulled the power back, raising the nose slightly. The B-29 floated, descending, the main wheels reaching for the ground. 400 pounds. "Come on, baby," Jim whispered. "Come on." And then, thump, the main wheels kissed the runway. The main wheels hit hard. Not a gentle touchdown. There was no time for gentle. Jim slammed City of Angels down onto Iwo Jima's runway 1 with 300 pounds of fuel remaining and 3 working engines coughing on fumes. The entire airframe shuddered violently, groaning like a wounded animal. Metal shrieked. Hydraulics hissed. The nose wheel dropped next, bang, and Jim stood on the brakes. Nothing happened. "Brakes aren't catching," Frank shouted, his hands flying to the emergency brake handle. The B-29 was still moving at 120 knots, rocketing down the 7,000-foot runway like a runaway freight train. Through the windscreen, Jim could see the devastation of recent battle. Bomb craters hastily filled with crushed coral, patches of bare metal runway plating, twisted debris shoved to the sides. And at the far end, where the runway terminated, nothing but black volcanic rock and the Pacific Ocean. 7,000 feet of runway. At their current speed, they'd burn through it in less than 30 seconds. Jim's right foot pushed the brake pedal to the floor. The pedal went soft, mushy. Hydraulic pressure was failing. Engaging emergency brakes. Frank yanked the handle. There was a mechanical grinding sound, and finally, Jim felt resistance. The brakes bit into the wheels. The B-29 began to slow. But not fast enough. 6,000 feet of runway remaining. 110 knots. Reverse thrust on 1, 2, and 4. Jim barked. Hammer through the thrust reverser switches. The 3 working engines screamed in protest as their propeller blades changed pitch, redirecting exhaust forward instead of back. The deceleration was immediate and brutal. Everyone in the cockpit lurched forward against their harnesses. 5,000 feet. 95 knots. Jim could see the crash crews now, fire trucks racing alongside the runway, their crews watching the smoking B-29 hurtle past. Through the side window, he glimpsed faces, young Marines, eyes wide, some making the sign of the cross. 4,000 feet. 80 knots. They were slowing. But the end of the runway was rushing toward them like a wall. Jim could see it clearly now, the abrupt edge where pavement gave way to volcanic rock, then a short slope, then nothing but ocean. In the back of the aircraft, the crew was silent. Pappy had his arms wrapped around a structural support, braced for impact. Willie's hands gripped his radio console so hard his knuckles had gone white. Tommy, the tail gunner, had his eyes squeezed shut, lips moving in silent prayer. 3,000 feet. 65 knots. The brakes were glowing red-hot now, smoking. Jim could smell burning rubber, superheated metal. The B-29 was vibrating so hard his vision blurred. And then, sputter, engine number 2 quit. The fuel had finally run out. 2,000 feet. 60 knots. Engine 2 is dead. Hammer called out unnecessarily. Everyone could feel it, the sudden asymmetric thrust, the B-29 wanting to yaw left. Jim corrected with rudder, fighting to keep them straight. Then engine number 1 coughed. Sputtered. Died. 1,500 feet of runway. 50 knots. We're not going to stop. Frank's voice was tight, controlled, but Jim heard the edge of panic beneath it. Only engine 4 was still running, and even it was faltering, starved for fuel. The thrust reversers were barely working now, providing minimal deceleration. 1,000 feet. 40 knots. Jim made a decision. "Everyone brace for impact," he shouted into the intercom. "We're going off the end." He wasn't going to make it. The math was simple and brutal. They had 1,000 feet of runway remaining and were traveling at 40 knots, about 45 miles per hour. Even with the brakes locked and smoking, they needed at least 800 feet to stop. Maybe more. 500 feet. 35 knots. Jim could see individual rocks now, the texture of the volcanic stone beyond the runway's edge. And beyond that, the cliff dropping to the ocean. Not a high cliff, maybe 15 feet, but enough. At 30 knots, they'd hit the water like a bomb. The B-29 would cartwheel, break apart. In the cold Pacific, they'd have minutes at most. 300 feet. 30 knots. Hold on. Jim screamed. Engine 4 died. 200 feet. 25 knots. The brakes were still locked, wheels skidding across the runway, leaving black streaks of rubber. The B-29 was a dead, smoking hulk now, coasting purely on momentum, every man inside praying to a god they'd largely ignored until this moment. 100 feet. 20 knots. Jim pulled back on the yoke uselessly, as if he could somehow make the aircraft lighter, make it stop faster. His entire body was rigid, muscles locked, waiting for the sickening lurch of ground giving way to air, then the catastrophic impact with water. 50 feet. 15 knots. They crossed the threshold. The nose of City of Angels went over the edge of the runway. And stopped. The entire aircraft lurched forward, then settled with a groan of tortured metal. The nose wheel was 6 inches past the end of the pavement, resting on volcanic rock. The main wheels were still on the runway, barely. If they'd been going 5 knots faster, they'd have tumbled over the edge. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then Willie's voice came over the intercom, shaky but alive. "Holy, holy mother of—" "Everyone okay?" Jim cut him off, his own voice not much steadier. "Sound off. Co-pilot, okay. Flight engineer, okay. Bombardier, okay. Navigator, okay. Radio, okay. Gunners, okay. All of us. 9 men. 9 voices. All alive." Jim's hands were shaking now, the adrenaline hitting him all at once. He looked over at Frank, who was staring straight ahead, eyes wide, face pale as chalk. "We made it," Frank whispered. "We actually made it." Through the windscreen, Jim could see the crash crews sprinting toward them, fire extinguishers ready, medics carrying stretchers. The B-29 was smoking from a dozen places, the dead engines, the brakes, the damaged wing section, but there was no fire. The fuel had all burned away. They'd landed on fumes and prayers. Jim fumbled with his harness, fingers numb and clumsy. When it finally released, he stood on legs that felt like rubber and made his way to the rear of the aircraft. The crew was already emerging from their positions, Hammer climbing down from the flight engineer's station, Willie and Pappy helping the gunners out of the cramped tail section. Jim reached the side hatch and threw it open. Bright sunlight and warm Pacific air flooded in, along with the smell of volcanic ash and the sea. He jumped down onto the wing, then onto the ground. Solid ground. His knees almost buckled. Marines were running toward them now, shouting questions, checking for injuries. But Jim wasn't listening. He was staring at City of Angels, at the smoking engines, the shredded metal where flak had torn through, the nose wheel perched on the very edge of the cliff. 6 more inches. 6 inches separated them from the ocean. From death. Captain Harlan? A young Marine lieutenant had appeared beside him, breathing hard from the run. "Are you and your men all right, sir?" Jim turned to look at his crew. Frank was sitting on the wing, head in his hands. Hammer was checking the damaged engine, shaking his head in disbelief. Willie and Pappy were smoking cigarettes with shaking hands. Danny, the bombardier, had dropped to his knees and was kissing the ground. And young Tommy Bridges was crying, silent tears streaming down his 19-year-old face. "Yeah," Jim said quietly. "Yeah, we're all right." But he was lying. They'd never be all right again. None of them would. You didn't come that close to death and walk away unchanged. Behind them, more B-29s were circling overhead. Other bombers from the raid, also critically low on fuel, waiting their turn to land on this tiny strip of volcanic rock in the middle of the Pacific. Iwo Jima had been captured for exactly this reason. To save men like them. And it had worked.